Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. I'm Dale Rowe, and I quote Walt Whitman's poem because that's how John and I addressed each other. Me, oh Captain, my Captain, and he, my doctor. I had the privilege of being a friend of John and Marilee's for 50 years after John approached me while flying on a P-3 aircraft from Jacksonville to San Diego. John thought that he and I and our wives should meet socially. We were both Navy lieutenants. John had already been in the Navy for many years, on board ship, through flight training, service as flight instructor, and experienced patrol plane pilot. When I met John, he was the patrol plane commander of the plane we were flying on. I, on the other hand, had been in the Navy for 6 months, then serving as a VP-16 flight surgeon. I was hitching a ride to qualify for monthly flight pay. I had no other duties I had to perform on that airplane other than learn how the crew performed their mission. It started then that John was my captain. When our squadron deployed to Sigonella, Sicily in 1973, John invited me to be his roommate at the BOQ for the 6 months that we were going to be deployed. He did have an ulterior motive, that crafty guy. He knew I was bringing my wife Ellen and son over to stay with me. They were not allowed to live on the base, so John knew that I'd only be on that room for 1 night out of 3 when I had to be on call at the base dispensary. The other 2 nights he had it to himself. Even with that abbreviated time as roommates, John and I had many discussions about Navy customs, rules, and regulations over games of cribbage. In short, John was mentoring me on the art of becoming an officer and a gentleman. Something about he was an expert. John always led the way with a determined gait. He expected us, his crew, and his family to follow the captain. Rarely stern, but always capable of making his desires known if we were not in tune with him. Like the time in Sigonella when he broke a bone in his foot while playing volleyball with members of the squadron at the BOQ. I overtreated it with too big of a cast that required release of some stitches on his uniform to get him undressed that night. I also grounded him from flying. Much later, like years later, I was told that John ignored that grounding and flew anyway, figuring out how to fly the plane without any flexibility in his ankle. None of his crew mentioned his insubordination to this ignorant roommate, the flight surgeon. John was given command of various Navy organizations from VP-19 to Naval Air Facility in Atsugi, Japan. He did achieve the rank of Navy captain, making it official then that he was my captain. By then, our relationship was purely friendship and social as we traveled to various posts for visits, but they were always fun and celebration. Ellen and I have many memories of play and joy with John and Marilee, like the time all 4 of us did somersaults down a grassy knoll after his change of command ceremony in San Jose with a fellow named Skippy Buns Delahan. Or when Ellen and I mentioned that we were going to Japan for a meeting and sightseeing. "We'll go with you," was John's response. And they did. They met us exactly at the time and spot on a train station in Tokyo as our train pulled in. John smiling, holding a large bottle of Jameson for us to enjoy on our trip. John and Marilee loved Japan, and they joyfully led the way for all of us to their cherished sites in Tokyo and Kyoto and the Japanese Alps. They introduced us to many of their Japanese friends, and John especially loved the Japanese baths, which I have to agree were wonderful. John's biggest battles have been fights with esophageal cancer and Alzheimer's. We celebrated his defeat of the esophageal cancer with a golf trip to Bandon Dunes with some of our sons. During that trip, Johnny disclosed one of his father's misadventures at the University of Oregon. When disclosed the next morning as a tease, Captain John was not pleased. And he made it clear with a stern gaze that that story wasn't to be released. Ellen and I have enjoyed several visits with John and Marilee to the Haleakala in Honolulu, their special place, one of their special places. These were when John's memories started to slowly slip away and he learned to follow his admiral, merrily. But John always knew who we were and enjoyed each moment, even when he wasn't sure where he was, especially if it involved ice cream or Honolulu cookies. Our last visit to West Lynn was 1 month before he died. John had stopped saying much, but still had a stern stare and occasional word that showed that he was still aware. His strident gait was gone, but if the doorbell rang, he was up to check out who was there. When he was asked who I was, he responded, "My doctor." He shook my hand with force for a long time, with a grin, as I replied, "My captain." The ship is anchored, safe and sound, its voyage closed and done, from fearful trip to victor ship with object won. Exalt, O shores, at Arlington, and ring, O bells and fire guns and cannon, but I with mournful tread walk the deck my captain lies. We'll miss you, John, but always celebrate and remember, O captain, our captain.
Thank you all for coming out today. Seeing all of you out there, the friends and family that were such an important part of my dad's life is really meaningful, so thank you. Trying to sum up my feelings for John Brockley in a few words or a few minutes is not possible, but I have a few thoughts. These days, people talk a lot about their rights, their right to free speech, their right to privacy, their right to assemble. And I'm sure my dad thought these rights were incredibly important. He spent 26 years in the Navy defending these rights. But I never actually heard him talk about them. What I did hear him talk about was duty. And that's something you don't hear much about these days anymore. Maybe it's more enjoyable to talk about rights, about what people owe us versus what we owe other people. I'm not sure Dad used the word duty, but it was woven in to everything he did. The duty to give his wife and kids a good life. The duty to look after his great Uncle Bob and to bring his father-in-law Joe into his home and look after him. The duty to take in his sister's 8-year-old boy when she died and to care for me as his own son. But maybe the reason that I never heard Dad use the word duty was because to him it wasn't duty at all. It was an expression of love. And for a guy who had an unshakable Clint Eastwood notion of what made a man, his love was not stoic. It did not come and go with his mood. It was enormous and unflinching and unwavering. He loved his sister, Marianne, and her little boy that he took in. He loved his son, Johnny, even though he was a beaver. That's the kind of truly unconditional love I'm talking about. He loved his daughter, Susan, fiercely, and his grandkids, his friends, all of you out there, he loved you so much. And anyone who knew my dad knows that he loved life, and he never failed to see the humor in it. The little things made him happy, the ducks, Jeopardy, slightly off-color joke. But there was one love that was bigger than all the rest. His wife, Marilee. His love for her was boundless, full of respect and admiration. They were a team, always. When people around me disparage marriage and say there's no such thing as a truly happy couple, I say that's something I can't say in a church. I've seen it, and it's the example I look up to in my own marriage. My mom, Marilee, shares with my dad that same duty that is not duty, but is love. Watching her and my sister, Susan, and my brother, Johnny, care for him these last few years as his mind began to falter, but his sense of humor never did. the generosity they showed him. This was the love, the duty that my dad showed us all. I love you, Dad. The world is not the same without you in it. And yet, here we are. And in a few minutes, we'll stand up and walk out of this church and go on with our lives, I guess. But I'll take you with me. I will hear your voice. I will listen for your voice when I'm sad or troubled, and I will raise a glass to you and celebrate when there's something to celebrate. Maybe even a glass of Prosecco. Maybe even too many glasses of Prosecco. Goodbye, Dad.
Good morning. My name's John Brockley Jr. Again, thank you, everybody, for coming to celebrate the life of a great man. I have a bit of a reputation in the family for not being able to hold it together when speaking at occasions like this. I understand there's a pool going on how long it will take before I start crying. Smart money's on the under. As my dad's health deteriorated over the last couple years, I often thought about what I would say at his funeral and how I could possibly condense it all in a short enough eulogy. Well, here goes. There are some foundational things about John Brockley. When I think of the saying, God, family, country, I think it perfectly describes him. His faith in God was unwavering. His family was the focus of his life, and he spent the majority of his working life serving our country in the Navy. But as Danny said, the center of his world was the former Merrily Tom. We said this in his obituary, but it deserves to be said again. Everyone should be so lucky to have someone love them as much as John Brockley and Merrily Brockley loved each other. Between 6 years of dating and 59 years of marriage, they were together 65 years. Pretty impressive. And they've been fantastic role models for their children and grandchildren. Models not just in their marriage, but also in how they conduct themselves and treat people. Integrity was at the core of his being. He loved children. He particularly loved his grandchildren. He was extremely proud of them, and it was a strong presence in their lives. He always said whoever named a grandchild Nell after his mother would get all of the inheritance. We think he was joking, but we were never 100% sure. He loved animals, particularly dogs. As kids, he was always a strong advocate for having a family dog. My mother was not a strong advocate for having a family dog. To be fair to her, she had small children and a husband who would be deployed 6 months at a time. So in hindsight, her reluctance was understandable. My father's solution to this dilemma was to have us kids give our mother a dog for Mother's Day. Reasoning that if the dog was a gift from her children, it couldn't possibly be refused. Any man who's been married more than a minute and a half knows that this was a risky strategy. But it worked. And Ginger became our family dog. In fact, it worked so well that after Ginger died and Mother's Day approached again, she was lucky enough to receive another dog on Mother's Day, and Dolly joined the family. There were repercussions, though. After his children were grown and Dolly passed away, he received a lifetime ban on having his own dog. But thankfully, he was allowed to babysit his granddogs, as he referred to them. Every family dog thought Granddaddy walked on water. He would buy boxes of Costco dog treats to ensure that they were properly spoiled when they visited. In fact, neighborhood dogs soon learned where the old guy with the dog treats lived. It wasn't uncommon to see humans struggling to get their dogs to continue their walks as they stopped and waited for him to emerge with their cookie. I was advised when reviewing my remarks that the section on dogs was longer than the section on grandchildren. I'd like to take this opportunity to assure everyone that as much as he loved dogs, he did in fact love his grandchildren more. And they loved him. He was fun. And he made a pretty good Santa Claus too. For me, my dad was always my go-to person. Throughout my life, whenever I needed anything, he was there. Whether it was something personal or something at work, he'd always say something that made me think or allow me to approach things in a different way that was helpful. I'll dearly miss that, and I'm very proud to share his name. In closing, there's a poem that's, I think, most often recited at Navy retirement ceremonies that I think is particularly fitting that I'd like to read. It's called The Watch. For 20 years, this sailor has stood the watch. While some of us were in school learning our trade, this shipmate stood the watch. Yes, even before some of us were born into this world, this shipmate stood the watch. Many times he would cast an eye ashore and see his family standing there, needing his guidance and help, needing that hand to hold during those hard times, but he still stood the watch. He stood the watch for 20 years. He stood the watch so that we, our families, and our fellow countrymen could sleep soundly in safety each and every night, knowing that a sailor stood the watch. Today, we are here to say, shipmate, the watch stands relieved. Relieved by those you have trained, guided, and led. Shipmate, you stand relieved. Dad, we have the watch.
We now have the first reading. A reading from the book of Ecclesiastes. There is an appointed time for everything, and a time for every affair under the heavens. A time to give birth, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to uproot the plant. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to tear down, and a time to build. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones, and a time to gather them. A time to embrace, and a time to be far from embraces. A time to seek, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to cast away. A time to rend, and a time to sow. A time to be silent, and a time to speak. A time of love, and a time of hate. A time of war, and a time of peace. The word of the Lord.
Shepherd me, O God, beyond my want.